All right, I'm going to go ahead and start. You can go here. All right, perfect. Is everyone coming in? Little slide before we begin. Perfect. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're so excited to have you all here with us. I wanted to take a moment and again, thank you for joining us for the Foundations of Domestic Violence webinar. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and this webinar will provide a comprehensive overview of domestic violence, its root causes, and its impact on victims and survivors. My name is Stephanie Nunley, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Training and Events Coordinator here at MOVA. And we are thrilled to welcome today's speaker, Gwendolyn Hampton Vincent, to lead the discussion. But before we begin, I have a few quick housekeeping items for all of you. This is a webinar format, so we will not be able to hear or see you. If you have any questions during the session, please type them into the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen, and our ASL interpreters will be visible throughout the webinar. But again, thank you again for being with us here today, and I can pass it off to Gwendolyn. Thank you, Gwendolyn, for coming.
Thank you for having me. All right, I'm going to share my screen. I'm so happy to be invited to present this conversation today. I have become a fan of this platform. Many of you might know, Mentimeter. But if you take your phone or tablet or your computer and you go to menti.com or you scan this QR code, you'll be able to follow along with the presentation. And at the end of the presentation, you can request for the slides and the results. As you go through the training with me, I have some opportunities for reflection, so you can sit in your seat and do them, or you can share them back so that MOVA has them, and those will also come back to you as participants. So I invite everyone to use the Menti and play with it along with me, but also it's not a requirement. So this is an important month. October is my favorite season. This is also a really important topic to me and my organization. We are 17 years old. We are located in Western Mass. I often say the real Western Mass because we're all the way in the corner of Massachusetts at the end of the Mass Pike. And we are a culturally specific public health organization. Since our founding, we've been minority run and women run. And minority, we prefer to use the term people of global majority or people that have been minoritized. But that is a state designation, meaning that we keep 51% of our board leadership run by women and people that have been minoritized historically. And our mission has always been about mutual respect and understanding. We're actually survivor-led. I am a co-founder with another woman, and we've worked within immigrant and African-American communities for our career. And you can see our core values. So that's a little bit about me. And then I'm going to talk about trauma-informed, culture-specific domestic violence responses. But first, I'd like you to do this trauma-informed check-in. And again, this is a moment where I would love it if people checked in and you can see how, then we can see how people are doing that we actually can't see. It's a way to still be in community together. But here from worried to on this continuum to able to discern, this is a trauma-informed response to check in about how you're feeling and how you're arriving for this conversation today. Many of us in this work can be survivors. There may even be survivors that are not in the work that are on this call, but we welcome everyone. And this is an opportunity to reflect. And again, I thank everybody that's participating. You can watch in the corner that 17 people have answered, and I think we have about 80 people here. It's a really helpful barometer to know how people are doing, especially since I can't see you. And I actually love to be in a circle. So this is another way to be in community. So you can see how people are across the continuum so far as they sit on this webinar. And I thank you all for sharing. Another question is, how are you arriving in your heart? If you can't find this Menti, don't worry about it, but you also can just type menti.com in whatever way you go online, and the code is at the top of the screen. So it's 566-4568. If you get lost, if you didn't catch the QR code. So this is how you're arriving in your heart. I'm arriving quite open. I shared with people I'm at a leadership institute for women, and it's a retreat for healing. So I'm feeling quite open. I'm halfway through the week. I'm happy to be with you all as a part of my healing process. And then on this continuum, I'd like to see how the rest of you are doing. And again, feel free to do this by your own body scan, your own check-in, and or mental. Again, you can see in a continuum, and I encourage people to be in community and process what's coming to them throughout the day. The last of the 3 trauma-informed check-ins is your body. So really, how is your body doing? Feel free to move around the computer so you can stand, you can move around as long as you're with us and attention. And this is a good practice at the beginning of meetings to do. You don't have to do it on Menti, you can just talk it through. You can allow people to check in quietly to themselves or with the group. It's a good way to check in if you're having an interaction with a client and someone working. So this is another continuum. Thank you for those who've shared. And thank you for those who've checked in. All right. So here's a question that when I'm talking about culture specific work, it's really important that we always check in with ourselves. Today, I'm very focused on my being a woman of color, because that's what this retreat here is for me. And the work that I'm talking to you about is culture specific work, but other people may bring other identities in. And it's really important for you to know what those identities are and why you hold them important, because it actually informs our work. So as when you talk about culture specific work and domestic violence, knowing your own identity is a part of that work with anyone you're interacting with. So again, you can write this on the Menti, or you can just think about it, but this is a really important practice of cultural humility, is to understand your own cultural identities and why they're important to you. And then another practice is to think of a friend or a relative that's important to you, and what do they hold for you? So when we're talking about domestic violence, there's a lot of familiar relations with people that are close to one another, that there's been some harm. So it's really important for you to have that sense of like what that empathy basically, what that would feel like. So doing this cultural humility check of knowing who are your friends and relatives, why are they important to you, what they hold in for you, it'll help you be more empathetic in a situation when you're trying to help people navigate through domestic violence. So these are good practices that I offer for you. And this last one, when you think about culture specific, think of a place or a holiday that holds traditional ritual for you. What does that ritual mean? What are the smells? What are the practices? What do you hear? What do you touch? Those things, being able to understand those aspects of culture for yourself helps you then be empathetic when that's disrupted, when domestic violence has occurred, and the process and journey of healing and addressing it. So when we're talking about culture specific and you're arriving in this conversation, you being able to do the scan on your own, it's like, what does this mean to you? So I know that we're moving a little quickly in this webinar, but these are 3 practices that are really important for people to be able to hold and embody what culture specific means. Yeah. Thank you. A lot of people are putting holidays down, just being together, gift giving, being able to show and give, be joyful. There's a holiday or place that I'm not familiar with, which I'll look up. Someone else said my hometown. I love going to the ocean as well. That's something that I share. Tying the family away with no distractions. So these rituals are important. So this is a good way to, again, practice empathy when you're thinking about this, this disruption in domestic violence. Someone checked in about their moral and unconditional love of their own good. Someone else, look at these here. Aspects of cultural identity, first generation college students. So these are all good questions that are good cultural community practices. So at this point, I've said the term quite a bit, but there's, actually legislation around this. Like the culturally specific means primarily directed toward racial and ethnic minority groups. And this is where it shows up in the public health service. And then I talked a lot about culturally relevant practices and responses. And so this is when we react and respond in a non-judgmental way to encourage active engagement, right? And that, again, in addition to this cultural humility practice, it's actually understanding the historical context. If you're dealing with immigrant survivors, if you're dealing with people that have been resettled from asylum, if you're dealing with African Americans, if you're dealing with veterans, it's really important to understand their historical context, because then you begin to understand how they're relating to what's happening. And that's historical and the cultural context. And then cultural competence is what I do all the time, and what I'm going to walk you through sort of the curriculum of cultural competence to walk through domestic violence. So when we talk about cultural competence, we're talking about this ability to navigate effectively across cultural difference in an informed and adaptive way. It requires all of this that we're going to talk about to reduce harm. And so I talked to you about walking through my curriculum. We start with shared knowledge. We're going to talk through some statistics. And then we're going to talk about language and culture around that. And then looking at how do we value diversity? How do we demonstrate we value diversity in our teams that we work with, as well as the clients that we serve? Looking at our own biases, looking at the biases of the organization, developing some tools to navigate difference and be inclusive advocates, as Stephanie said, and then also looking at some models of how to adapt policy and procedure to be culturally specific and respond to these. So in my work, there's a continuum that we work on. It first came from the medical model, and now they use it across most practices. But a cultural competence continuum ranges from being culturally destructive to culturally proficient. I'm giving you the short version here. But culturally destructive is when you're actively ignoring or excluding a group based on their cultural practices, when they're not able to access services based on their cultural needs. Cultural incapacitated is when you're sort of like, yeah, these things are nice to have, but they're not really necessary, and you don't have the resources in place to do it. Right. And so it's up to the client to figure it out. When we put that back on the client versus institutions, that's when we can be culturally incapacitated. Cultural blindness is right along with color blindness. When you don't see a person's identity, you don't ask what's important to them culturally, or what, and all the things that we started with, then you miss a lot about an individual. Some of these things they may not know because it's what they carry with them naturally. And it takes some work for you to figure that out with them. But those can be some of the barriers to getting the help of the healing in domestic violence issues. So one size fits all does not work in most cases, and that includes domestic violence. Culturally pre-competent, this is when you know there's a difference and you're beginning to figure out how to respond differently. You're beginning to see that we need to increase more awareness in our teams and within ourselves, of self-awareness. And then cultural competence is when you really know the difference. You have, I'm going to say, resources behind it, budget, healing resources for your staff, managers and staff that reflect the constituents that you serve. Your mission is aligned around this. When you have all those resources in place, that's when you're hovering in the cultural competence area. And then culturally proficient is when you become a strong advocate in this space, which I'm hoping all of you do become. Based on your journeys professionally or as an individual. But this is the continuum, and the arrows on the bottom signify that any of us can find ourselves anywhere on the continuum, given the circumstances, given the interaction with individuals that might be different than an individual set that we've worked with before, based on culture, language, their stories. So a continuum means we can move up and down. The idea here is to be able to assess where you're at any given moment. So that is the tool that I think is really helpful here when you're talking about cultural competence. And I wanted you to just take a self-check of where do you think you are? And we actually left out cultural competence by accident. So you can put cultural competence and cultural proficiency together. But so between culturally destructive, if you have in your mind that you really only know one way to do your work and you haven't really adapted it, that's where you can really look in the mirror and say, come on, this is where I need to really do some work. I need to do some research. You need to do that. Incapacitated is when you're beginning to understand. You don't think it's make or break it. You think people need to heal, and we're humans and we can all heal. And then cultural blindness, and you don't see difference. Pre-competence, when you know you want to change. And again, we missed the big one, which is cultural competency. My mentee, I'm sorry. So you can put it in cultural proficiency. We'll take that into account, that that's cultural proficiency and cultural competence. But again, the most important there is it's resourced, and you're beginning to become advocates, right? So the between competent and proficient. So you can see, and you can just begin to use that tool. You'll get this PowerPoint. You can use it as a self-check. And this is about your agency. So if you work for an agency, you could answer this question. And again, use that same model for cultural competence and proficiency. If you see yourself as a strong advocate that can advocate across difference, if you feel like your organization has resources in place, we put it here. If you feel like, I know there's this group of people who have no idea how to resource them. We don't know what are the cultural patterns of how they deal with grief, how they deal with harm in the community, what are the power dynamics. If you don't know those things about cultural groups that you work with, then I would put yourself in incapacitated blindness area, right? So just thinking about this and thinking about your agency, again, not to prescribe your agency and say we're good or bad. It's to focus on areas of improvement and to identify where you need to find other resources. So I hope this is a helpful check. So when we talk about domestic violence, probably many of you here, if you got the email and the invitation, you know this, but I'm just, this session promised the basics too. So we're talking about domestic violence. It's harm that occurs among family members or relatives, or things that happen, quote unquote, in the home, in harm that's caused. And it can happen in forms of physical violence, it can happen from stalking, it can happen as emotional and psychological harm, and that can include isolation. It can be financial and economic harm, and sexual abuse, sexual coercion, and rape. All these things fall within this large umbrella of domestic violence, right? And there can be more detail in a sublist under each of these, but this is a kind of a general starting point. And then what we like to talk about is how do we characterize responses to domestic violence and sexual assault? So we see a lot of depression, we can see anxiety, we can see post-traumatic stress disorder. We can also see low self-esteem and low self-worth. We can see a lot of difficulty trusting others, a lot of intimacy issues show up. We can be striving for perfection. Everything's got to be exactly right. Nothing can go wrong, right? Substance abuse and over substance use, over usage. Physical health problems can manifest, right? And then some of the behaviors can be self-harm, can be self-sabotage, everything's going right, and all of a sudden things fall apart. And this homicidal and suicidal ideation, all of these things can be responses that individuals have to domestic violence. And I think many of you may have seen this as power and control cycle of violence. I just wanted to put it here again as a reminder. And if it's new, there's a whole lot of work you can do with this tool, with clients and with your staff. But in this power and control model, right, you can see there's economic abuse, there's coercion and threats, there's intimidation, there's emotional abuse, and as I said earlier, isolation. And there's this gaslighting, denying, minimizing, blaming scenario where people can literally be hurt, physically hurt, and somehow convince themselves that they did it, or it wasn't the other person's fault, or the other person could convince them of that. Using the children and pets, like weaponizing them, using them as tools of, if you do this, then you'll lose your children or it'll hurt the pet. And this privilege can be a sense of, sometimes oftentimes because of society, it can be male dominance, but it's not just that, right? It could be the person with the wealth in the family. It could be the person that's earning income for the family, right? Those are privileges within a family structure, right? That can cause one individual to hold power over another individual. And when they use that in abusive ways and cause harm, that's when the cycle starts. So hopefully this is a tool to look at. We used it just this week in our bridge program, and a woman said, "Thank you for helping me open my box and actually really just having a specific partner. I looked a little bit up about some updated data. So intimate partner violence is just what it sounds like. It's when the domestic violence is within an intimate relationship, right? And these are some data points I found. Nearly 3 women in the US are killed by an intimate partner every day. 1 in 3 Latinas experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Gender-based violence disproportionately affects the specific population, the Latino population. African-American women experience this at a rate of 35% higher than white women, at 2.5 times higher than women of other races. And women in the US are more likely to be killed by an intimate partner than by anyone else. 55% of homicides of women involved in domestic violence, 93% were killed by current or former boyfriends, husbands, and partners. Every day, 3 women are killed. This is staggering data. Again, the signs are similar, but I wanted to separate them out. The signs of intimate partner violence, physical violence, threats to gain control. We talked about it in the wheel, right? Isolation from family and friends. Using drugs, alcohol, or other influences as an excuse for the violence. Blame for you for their behavior and their consequences. These people also embarrass, berate, and make fun of you in front of others, right? That's when it happens quite a bit. And then sexual pressuring. So these are signs of that intimate partner violence is. Gender-based violence is when this power, when people experience violence based on their gender, right? So here's some more data. 30% of women globally have experienced either physical and or sexual intimate partner violence and non-partner sexual violence. This is the World Health Organization in November of 2023. 42% of women who experience intimate partner violence report an injury as a consequence of this violence. 56% of murders of women worldwide are committed by an intimate partner or close family member. Less than 40% of women who experience violence seek help of any sort, and fewer than 10% of those seek help reporting it to the police. 38% of women worldwide have experienced online violence, and 85% of women who spend time online with this digital violence happening against other women. 91% of the detected victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation regularly. So is posting and felt this is again hard data, but important data to look at. So going back to this umbrella that I do my work under, is the cultural competence umbrella. Things that we wanted you to think about when you're being culturally specific, looking at understanding the immigration process and the status, and having that knowledge at your fingertips is really important. Being engaged in immigrant justice issues, it changes across states and counties and federally, but it's really important to understand immigrant justice. Having an historical analysis on race, right, in our country, understanding the generational legacy of racism and systemic racism is required to work with African Americans, Indigenous folks. Having cultural knowledge, being open to learning about different cultures is really, really important. Again, other systemic knowledge, we'll talk about isms later, but understanding all the different isms that a family might confront, so that a victim in domestic violence may not want to cause another quote unquote harm by speaking up about their issue. This is one of the real barriers to people seeking help. Trauma-informed principles and approach, ability to self-assess. And then another thing that's extremely important is that no agency can do all of it. So having culturally specific partners when it's not an area that you have a strength in is a way to be culturally competent. Moving on, and I want to talk about trauma-informed. We use these terms a lot, and I think it's really important just to go to the basics sometimes. Trauma is an emotional response to an event, right, that threatens or causes harm. It's often the result of an overwhelming amount of stress that exceeds one's ability to cope with or accept the emotions involved. Trauma can be a traumatic event or it can be an ongoing. Right? I wanted you to reflect on this question before we get into the trauma-informed approach. What are your personal strategies to manage trauma? So when trauma arises, when harm arises, when there's a traumatic event, what are your strategies that you have? What's in your toolkit to manage trauma? And thank you. First answer here is prayer. Weekly therapy, yeah, walking the dog, meditation, mindfulness, self-care. Meditation and talking, breathing, therapy, walking, AA, and being alone. Fresh air, breath work, therapy, friends, traffic, music. Thank you for sharing this. Discussing with loved ones, walking, prayer, therapy, exercise, yoga, therapy. It's really important to know like what's in your toolkit. Like, how do you manage to sleeping? Sleeping is one of the best medicines that you can have. Leaning into community. What do you do to manage trauma with your clients? Do you use the same toolkit? Do you have other strategies? So when it comes, if you work with clients, those of you that work with clients in this time, what strategies to use to manage trauma with clients? Is it the same as above? Do you have other strategies to use? Empathetic listening is really important. You don't have to fix it all the time, whether that be part of our jobs. One thing is just to have that safe space where people can be heard. Grounding, remain calm, empathize. I heard a phrase this week that I hadn't heard before. My practice is to say people need to be seen, heard, and understood. And I heard this week that when people are heard, it's as good as people are being loved. That there's research that shows that sometimes people can't discern the difference, and people really feel heard. It's equivalent to feel loved. Naming trauma and validating it. Yeah, witnessing, verbal processing, breath work, listening, being encouraging, validating through active listening. Those are really good. And now, something that we don't always talk about, but that shows up, maybe it's just can be in the background, because sometimes we say our traumas are meeting each other in our workplace. A lot of people in this work are survivors. So thinking about strategies when that's happening, right? When trauma meets trauma, right? In a workplace, or when we're hearing all the destructive news that makes someone feel more at risk, or like more harm is coming down the pike. When you're trying to work with a client, like what are your strategies there? How do you keep people centered? How do you address the issues? These are questions I think are really important. So if you can see my train of thought, there's a cultural humility approach of managing your own trauma. Then there's being able to manage your interactions with clients. And then there's being able to manage the environment that we're in, right? You and your clients. So those are different types of trauma that we're all experiencing. The world is an intense place at the moment. From the climate to the election and everything in between. And then you have a client that's living in trauma. So it's really important to be able to help people sort it out and come up with the strategies to manage it at all levels. So self-care, prayers, venting, going for a walk, talking with coworkers about shared experiences, affinity groups, coworker support, speaking to managers, taking paid time off. We use this a quick thing in our office too, like tapping out, right? So just tapping out for a moment, asking someone to cover you for something so you can take that walk. Taking a break from the work. Yeah, the apps, there's lots of apps for yoga, for breathing, for drinking water. Opening up meeting support, you want to for space and break. This is really important. We're not going to be able to avoid trauma happening. We have to come up with strategies of how to navigate it. And we want to mitigate one and reduce it, but it will still happen. We have to live with that reality. So I think we've done most of this, right? In my shared knowledge and cultural competence, I wanted us to be sharing the same amount of information. So we talked about intimate partner violence, we talked about DV, we talked about gender-based violence. we mentioned how important it is to be able to really identify cross intersection identities, race, culture, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual identity. All these things will inform your interactions with someone trying to navigate domestic violence issues. And also being able to work through cultural beliefs, because these cultural beliefs are powerful. That's a lot of the time, a lot of the barrier lives here. So this is why I think the cultural competence work is so important in the domestic violence work. Moving into my second section of cultural competence, valuing diversity. This is a little shorter than all that shared knowledge that I wanted us to have. Valuing diversity, we use the shortcut of the cultural competence rule, which is the platinum rule of mutual respect. And it's treat people how they would like to be treated. So that's a simple leveling up of the golden rule, but it's really important and it requires a lot of focus, right? To really listen and validate, ask questions, and then come up with strategies together, work alongside your plans, right? So you can be operating in a culture specific manner. You can't possibly come knowing everything about every culture, including the culture of an individual family, without working alongside your plan. So you have to build trust, you have to let information emerge and relationships emerge, and you have to really operate with empathy. And another day, I'd love to talk. We have this fun activity around empathy, and there's about 12 empathy detractors, things that we think are empathy that are not, and then what is actual empathy. We're thinking about how you can validate someone's experience without over sympathizing or one-upping it, and different things like that is an important thing to talk through. What is empathy actually? Also, I talked about this a little bit earlier, valuing diversity. Language, our language around this work has shifts and continues to shift. Our language, just being actual what cultural language you speak. These are different things that we have to figure out how to navigate. Some cultures, trauma doesn't even, there's no word for that in the cultures. And so coming up with the closest translation or explanation is really important. Different cultural practices. And this is something we do that we learn from our anti-poverty work, which is identifying the resources, resource mapping for an individual. They may not have money, but they might have their church, or they might have cousins in another state. I'm not quite sure what it would be, but being able to have people identify their resources so they don't feel like if they walk out of the situation, they have nothing. But being able to map out the resources. Dr. Ruby Payne has this map of 11 essential resources people have, and money and wealth is only one of them. So we try to use that as our clients so that they can map out, what do I have? What are the resources that I do have? So if I don't have this one thing, or if I lose connection with this group of people, what else do I have? So that's an important piece of me bigger than domestic violence. And then we talk about bias awareness. This is the third part where we ask people to continue to do self-evaluations, self-assessments, assess your departments, assess your organization. And then when you're looking at families, we want us to be able to understand what biases are operating. So when an individual's coming in front of you, are they operating through expectations around gender roles, perceptions of different cultural groups on what's a good family, right? What's a good wife, and those types of things. What have been the historical cultural interactions with law enforcement? Because if someone's relationship is this week, the massacre last week, the massacre is happening in Haiti, people respond differently when they see people in uniform. And this person in uniform in this community might be the most helpful, the most kind, the most empathetic, but somebody's seeing a uniform, somebody's seeing a gun. We're looking at all the negative news about how police are killing, people without cause. So those things are biases that people come to interactions with, or won't want you to call the police, or won't go to the police for help. It's not just sort of protecting the family all the time. It's also these other biases that exist. And then the other one is, I learned from Dr. Jennifer Gomez, this new theory, cultural betrayal theory, which is putting language and research to what I've been talking about when families don't want to disclose. If you have a family that's, say, mixed documentation and there's been abuse within the household, oftentimes they won't want to report because it could expose people that then could get deported. That's like a shortcut of a scenario. There's much more complication than nuance to it, but that's the kind of thing of people feeling like, why would you if you speak up, you're the one that's bringing shame to the family. And that's a big thing in African American communities that I've seen. And sometimes it comes to the churches. And that is something that we have to help our clients navigate, right? That is a pattern that shows up. Dr. Gomez has labeled it cultural betrayal theory, and why a lot of people don't speak up. And so we have to come up with tools and strategies to help people identify that and still work through their journey of healing, however best suits them and their family, which may not be the path we choose, but it will be a path that is in alignment with them on the path of healing, and it could change over time, right? So this is where I put that to be seen is to be loved, because I love that little phrase. I added it this week. But while you're thinking through bias isn't a bad word. Bias is the summary of our prior experiences, our education, where we lived, where we've studied, how we've been raised, where we've practiced our religion. So we have all this bias around us because it's been our context. And we have to sometimes really work at learning to step out of that and learn a different way, or understand or develop empathy about a different way of being, a different set of value systems. So that's the bias awareness piece. It's just work. It's like going to the gym. You know, we have our way, each of us individually, because of who we are and who we've been in the world and where we live. But then everyone else has their own story as well. So the effort to understand that and to listen to that is how we can do our work best. So I'm mindful of the time. So this one, navigating difference in culture. This was one of the things promised, to identify root causes of domestic violence. And I feel like this list could go on forever. I try to break it up in a similar format to the way I do our race equity work. We have these 4 areas of individual, interpersonal, cultural, and systemic when we look at race and how race impacts the relationship. And we look at gender, or we look at socioeconomic status. So I've used a similar model to look at the root causes of domestic violence, right? So looking on that individual level, we can think about gender inequity, right? Gender expectations, all the isms and sexism, anger and self-esteem can be what an individual brings, knowledge of self-regulation, right? Or how do you have that skill? Some people are born with it innately, some people have to be taught that skill. Where do people land on mental health, brain health, you know, their mental disorders, are there psychological disorders, are there brain injuries involved? There are a lot of things that can be happening. And then substance use and or abuse, currently or historically. A lot of times it's the household that an individual grew up in that seeps through and causes this continuation of domestic violence. So those are some individual. When we go to the relational or interpersonal level, again, witnessing violence in family of origin can be the only way someone's learned how to relate, or how they've been taught by an individual, say a father has taught this to a son, this is how you have to manage your wife or your partner. So that gets passed on. Toxic masculinity, what it means to be a man and needing to exert this power, this belief that there needs to be this power over. A need for control. So either a destructive need for control, or a time or an individual that's always felt out of control and feels like this is a place where they can maintain control through violence. And then another, again, I've talked about things over and over, but I don't think it hurts to hear them again. Gender roles, gender expectations, culturally, how those show up. And then trust should be another bullet in here. And that's really important. I do a lot of work around trust. People treat trust like it's a feeling, but trust can really be codified. And we use a model that says that trust is care, competence, sincerity, and reliability. And so when you have those things, people feel more secure. If you don't have that trust, then people try to, again, find places that they think that they feel security. They think that they have control. So trust can be an issue. And that's been broken. On the community level, media And media is just everything, right? It can be social media, it can be the news. I like some of the self-care that people shared earlier because I sometimes just have to stop watching the news, right? Or I'll read the transcript of the debate just for my own self-protection, right? Because I feel like there's a lot of violence that just comes involuntarily if you turn on the TV, or if you go onto your social media. So media overload can happen. A lot of the violence that's in video games, it desensitizes young people when there's just so much violence. So media overload can be one. Othering. So a lot of the work we do in cultural competence is trying to create a sense of belonging. When people consistently feel on the outside or diminished or like they don't belong, that can also create a place where people want to feel like they have control, want to feel like this is my space, this is where I'm in charge. And that can also create scenarios of violence, right? So the othering that community does can cause that violence to be happening in the home. And then pressure to be or to represent a certain family or partner. So if you're, say, a minister's wife or a college president's, partner or something like that, right? Those types of roles in community, there can be, how could you speak up and diminish this person or diminish this family? So those things can be ways in which people don't speak up, but also can be ways in which it just is a pressure cooker inside of the house, inside of the home. Right? And this one, navigating difference in society. So poverty is one ism, right? So socioeconomic issues. And then it says isms here. We could talk about racism, classism, sexism, all these isms. There's a term called kyriarchy, which is, it's like intersectionality, but of systems. So that term is kyriarchy. And that can talk about the intersecting systems of oppression. So if somebody's feeling all of that, again, the home might be the shock absorber for that. Access to jobs, access to healthcare, access to education, access to a sense of a community, right? I said we're a public health organization. We work a lot on social determinants of health, and having access to community and neighborhood is a piece of being healthy, right? So people feel isolated, and again, the house and the home might be the place that absorbs that.
Gwendolyn, I'm sorry, we do have one question. It would just say, could you please restate the 4 areas you articulated of trust? I heard competence and serenity and missed the other 2.
Thank you. So I have sincerity, competence, care, and reliability. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you.
When I'm not talking, I feel like I just can go on. So please feel free to interrupt. Thank you so much. Responses to domestic violence. These are ways I think we promised Stephanie and I have in there inclusive advocacy. So these are some of the lists that I've shared before that I wanted to share. Allowing individuals to disclose. So even if you know or you see or you hear the pattern, not necessarily naming it and labeling it for an individual, letting an individual disclose when they're ready. Giving back agency to survivors, like I said, working alongside, right? Giving, that's a guarantee that you might get a more culture specific response if you work alongside the person you're working with, and also help them map out their resources like I talked about, show them that there's always a choice, right? Not defining an individual by deficits or what's happened to them, right? That's really important. Again, that resource mapping helps with that because they begin to see what they have instead of what they don't have or what they might be losing. And that's important. Judgment free. This is where you have to know your own biases to know when they might be interfering with a case or an individual. So understanding how to manage your own bias so that you can create this judgment free interaction. Remain open and curious. Avoid stacking harm. So part of being culturally competent and doing your own cultural humility work and your own cultural research is that you don't want to be causing harm with the very people we're trying to support, right? So oftentimes people don't go into agencies because they're going to feel like 10 other things are thrown on them by the time they get out. They're going to not feel heard. So figure out how you can be a part of the solution and not stack more harm on an individual with rules or lack of resources for their cultural group and identity. Respect cultural practices. And again, I said earlier quickly, like, we may not choose the path of healing that an individual chooses for themselves, but we aren't really the people that can evaluate cultural practices and cultural norms and family and what that means to them. So figuring out how to just continually reinforce what healthy living and healthy relationships look like, provide resources and walk alongside an individual, but not degrading their cultural practices. Continue to offer opportunities to educate, like I said, understand cycles of violence, sorry about the typo, and develops culture specific strategies, and normalize cycles of healing. So understanding the cycles of violence, you also have to understand that people go through cycles of healing. Sometimes people are like, I already went through this. I've already talked about this. I've already disclosed. And then it comes back in a different way. And being able to normalize that for someone can be really valuable. I want to thank Jackie and Michael for their work. I know I can talk really quickly, so thank you very much for interpreting. Some trauma-informed interactions, I want to talk about. The first piece is that listening, that empathetic, active listening. Empathizing. I see you're upset. I understand that we didn't serve you well. I understand that the impact was this. Really, again, making people feel seen, heard, and understood, right? Validating and affirming their experience. Asking, tell me what can be improved. What can I do? How can I support you? What would improve the situation for you? This is a really important one, paraphrase, because when we summarize what we've heard, people get the opportunity to hear what they said, maybe correct, and also feel heard and understood. So paraphrasing is a really important tool. And summarizing what you got out of the scenario and say, did I get that right? Which I don't have on the slide, but summarizing, this is what I hear you saying. And did I get that right? These are really good trauma-informed interactions that give people, again, that agency back. They can revise, they can edit, they can, tell their story the way they want it told. So these are really important. This is an important little script that we have. And here it is. I think, here's whoever asked me for the trust. It's up here on the screen. And again, you'll have these slides. I was trained on some of this trust and safety work with the Department of Justice Community Relations Service Division. And I understood that harm meant being physically harmed or being threatened. What I learned now over a dozen years ago, but what I learned is a perception of harm is also a civil right. And so I think that validating that for everyone is really important. Today we've talked about domestic violence, but we also talked about managing the trauma that we get, that we manage in our own selves, we manage with clients, and we also manage in the workplace. And we all need to be able to feel safe in our work. And then I talked about trust in relation to what clients need, maybe what have disrupted and why they go to violence is because trust has been broken. But also we need to be able to quantify and qualify that work, right? Not get a feeling about a client, not get a feeling about a staff member, especially if they're working in a different language or cultural norm than we're used to. So it's good to be able to use trust as this shared map of how, these 4 areas of trust as a shared map and how to navigate this work. So, and then the last area, so in my cultural competence curriculum, it's shared knowledge, it's valuing diversity, it's addressing bias, and it's navigating difference. So we've talked through those 4 areas today. And the last is adapting practice, like how all this information shows up and how we interact, what programs we provide, what's our management style at work. So it's really important that we ideate about this. We have like generative conversations at work about what can be improved as we think about working with different cultural groups. We can look for barriers and support different types of resolution. We can build on what's already worked for clients. We can build what's already worked for us in an agency. the most important thing is allowing for space and time to heal. And again, I'm going to repeat the strategy of identifying culture-specific community partners that may not be the domestic violence expert, but might know the cultural group, and might have access to a cultural group, or might already have that trust in community that you can be most effective working with. Those is that last area. In my organization, I wanted to share a couple more things I haven't shared yet. I think in our culture-specific examples in management and programming, we provide financial literacy because in the services we can provide with MOVA and VOCA funds, we sometimes felt like we were putting a Band-Aid on something. And so we ended up getting approved to do financial literacy courses. The Getting Ahead program is the one we use mostly, but we also partner with our banks, and most banks and credit unions have a financial literacy course for community. And so those are good strategies. So it gives people something to hold on to, something to do that's structured on their path to healing, that makes them feel empowered. It does empower them. Alternative healing programs. So in our organization and where we are in rural Western Mass, we do fish fries, pig roasts, harvest festivals. This is the season we're in right now. We also do Mother's Day and the holiday celebrations. We do a natural hair care salon for African Americans, for those African diaspora. And we have a lot of alternative healing practices come through in wellness days. We have a commitment to supplier diversity, which we've worked through with MOVA and VOCA, that we look for practitioners that reflect the community that we serve. So it may not be the cheapest or the most well-known or meet the normal criteria for vendor procurement, but it meets our cultural procurement criteria. Staff management, so coming up with resources to talk about vicarious trauma, have their own sessions to debrief, work through their work, because a lot of people that come to this work are survivors ourselves, cross-cultural interactions, and supervisions that needs a different kind of supervision often. So when you're working across multiple cultures, how do we spend time on that? And also really respecting different healing modalities that show up in different cultures. Some of the opportunities that we've had for our clients, our survivors, are supporting their entrepreneurial efforts, because that's a pathway out, right? They need to be able to be financially stable to leave their domestic violence scenarios often. And then we also have supported Serve Safe certification, helping people develop catering businesses and working cultures. So those are some of the strategies we've used. And I don't know if we have time for questions, so I'm going to flip through these really fast and then go to Q&A. But this is more about Bridge. And we're again in rural Western Mass. So this is the picture. And what I think is most important, I want you to see, is just the joy that, like, the healing from domestic violence and trauma and families can be happy. You know, our children's program is Happiness Toolbox, where you can see farms and growing food and just working together across cultures. And so I just love this collage. This shows this is our Bridge community. And then these are numbers which you can look at later on. And the demography is significant for us because we're in a rural area. So the numbers might be small for a big urban place, but for us to get this many people of color in a predominantly white area, getting services about their victimization is a game changer for us. And I'm really grateful to VOCA and MOVA. So the 4 components of our program, just the last piece, is culture-specific education and empowerment. And we partnered with the Department of Justice for a Know Your Rights event with the FBI and the police and the district attorney and the U.S. Attorney's Office all came, and we convened our community members to ask questions and educate them on victimizations and hate crimes. And these are our kiddos. We have a youth leadership program. Culture-specific healing. I mentioned earlier what some of those are. This has been our way of outreach and education, is bringing people into these programs and then providing the services. We opened up a transition supportive housing family shelter that's culture specific. So the spices and the hair products and the decorations are all in alignment with the cultural groups that we serve. We preserve food on the farm, so you can see people have made epis, pico de gallo, chile verde. This is our homestead home. and then our advocacy work. Things like doing this training are really helpful, I think, in advocating for the kind of culture-specific work that needs to be done. And so we work with those people that we mentioned came to our Know Your Rights series. These are people from the U.S. Attorney's Office and very recent appointed judges. So that's what I got for you. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Gwendolyn, so much for that. We do have one question because we have about 5 minutes.
Yes.
The question is regarding the 11 resources that people have outside of money. And just for a little context, it's for the resource mapping.
So if you write down the name Dr. Ruby Payne, Payne, she's written a book, Understanding the Frameworks of Poverty. And she has a program called Bridges Out of Poverty. And we actually have gotten some of our staff trained to be getting ahead facilitators. And that's the program that our constituents do, where they do the resource mapping. We've also integrated that into our client interactions and interviews just to help people figure out strategies of how to move forward. We know the resources in our community agencies and systems and, the community groups we worked with, but we also ask them to say, what resources do you have? And that may take a few sessions and conversations, but that's helpful. It's putting that together. But Dr. Ruby Payne is and Bridges Out of Poverty is the work. I do have to say that Dr. Ruby Payne, in her research has not addressed race. Bridge and the work that we do, we've kind of overlaid that. But the resource mapping, because a lot of times poverty is mixed in with domestic violence, it's really important to be able to work with the poverty analysis with our clients. So we use Dr. Payne's work, but we overlay our own cultural competence work on top of it.
Thank you. And then we do have just a huge thank you to you for sharing all your knowledge and experience with us.
Thank you. Stay in touch. I guess that you can scan and you have my email here. Thank you.
Thank you. Don't see any other questions coming in. We have roughly 4 minutes.
Are you doing your survey, you said?
Yes, I'm going to actually put that right in our chat now. Thank you so much. I'm going to make sure that we have that. And for everyone, I am putting a link to our evaluation. So please feel free to take some time and to provide some feedback. That will definitely help us have different speakers and just know exactly how much this training helped you. But we did get one question in the chat, and it says, what are the most pressing opportunities for advocacy around the intersection of domestic violence and foster care?
Would you repeat that again?
Of course. What are the most pressing opportunities for advocacy around the intersection of domestic violence and foster care?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have the answer. Other people in the community would, but I feel like the foster care system has to commit to doing training of all their foster care parents along all the lines that I just talked about, just as if they were working for an agency. I have done training for foster care systems before. And that's what I find is like, it's often we want to get a child out of a situation and that stacking of harm can happen if they're in a family that doesn't understand their cultural needs. And or with other children with other traumas and it gets exacerbated. So I think that the system needs to make sure that foster care parents are treated just like any other domestic violence service provider. And those resources I would advocate for their resources to go so that everything I talked about today would apply to any parent structure as well. That's my 2 cents. That's helpful. And then that raise their hand again. So it keeps disappearing. You can see the raised hands.
We have a question if this presentation can be emailed to us. We can share.
I think if you signed into the Menti at the end of it, I think it says, would you like a copy of it? But we also send it to MOVA, and it's a MOVA, they'll be able to send it out. It's okay with me.
Thank you.
Yep, some of my typos. I'm sorry. I'm in the woods, and so fixing all the little things is a little difficult. So the night cleaning is up. Yeah.
Thank you. We will make sure to send it out. And of course, thank you so much for everyone joining us today. And we look forward of course, Gwendolyn, to work again with you. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for honoring this month in this way. It's really an honor to be able to present. Thank you.
And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day today.
Yep.
Bye.